Okay, so we are so now we're starting out into photography. So we're starting out from ASCII art. We're actually moving really to the photographic era. So today we're going to talk about all the theory regarding photography. And so we're going to talk about a little history, a little theory, and some practical stuff about how to take better pictures. So why is photography important in our culture? So give me everybody give me one reason. Yes, sir?
Instagram.
Say that again, Instagram? So Dre says Instagram. Okay, Eve? Historical moments. Marissa? Capture important what?
Events.
Capturing important events. Michael? Memories. Ty? Important events. Sporting events. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Tyler? A picture is 1,000 words. Very good. Okay, that's all really good. So historical documentation, family documentation, memories, and no one mentioned the biggest one in my book, which is photography as an art form. Okay, so photography actually is an art form in its own right, right? So one of the outcomes of this unit is that I want you to come away as a better photographer. So photography was my first art form. I picked up a camera at age 12 and I haven't stopped since. So I love to talk about photography. And I think photographic history is really interesting. So actually photography, what did it replace culturally? Okay, so if we look back, say, to 1400, 1500, 1600, we didn't have photographs, so how do we know what people looked like, Ty?
Paint.
Yes! Painting. So photography, do you think photography has replaced painting?
No.
No. We're saying no, photography has not replaced painting. No. But has it replaced painting for certain things?
Yes.
Like what?
Selfies.
Selfies, yeah, you can't paint, well, you can paint a self-portrait, but yeah, that's a lot, whereas anyone can take a selfie. So newspaper, any kind of news or news-related stuff. And so painting still has its place, but prior to the invention of photography, who do you think got their portrait painted? Rich? People who are rich? People who are famous, and people who were royalty, right? So if you had a title, if you were born into a wealthy family, or if you were a ruler, you got your portrait painted. If you had a lot of money and your family was middle class, you could still pay to have your portrait painted. So up until the invention of photography, we have mostly the people who culturally own imagery are all rich, titled, or both, right? Nobody else, for example, working class, farmers, those people aren't getting their portraits painted. So only if you had enough money could your likeness be preserved, right? And that all changed with the invention of photography. But it started with painting. So this little baby here is called a camera obscura. And what we're looking at here, can you see it? It's a completely dark room with a teeny, this looks like a humongous hole, but actually it would be a teeny tiny pinprick hole. Projects an image on the back wall upside down, and the artist can draw over it. Now, I'm going to escape out of it. There are still artists who do this today. So here's what a camera obscura image looks like. This artist, Alberto Morelli, that's the Brooklyn Bridge, by the way. And so, can you see, so what he will do is he'll find the perfect view of the architectural landmark that he wants to document, and he will go and find that perfect spot, that perfect apartment, hotel room, whatever. And I read about his process. He completely darkens the room, gives it all black walls, and in the window he gives this tiny pinprick hole, and then in complete darkness it will project an image of whatever is outside. and then he photographs that. But if you were, this is an example of the camera obscura in action. So there, Paris, there's the Eiffel Tower. Pretty cool, huh? I can only imagine what he has to go through to get permission to photograph in these rooms. Like, whose bedroom is that, right? Kind of make it, for me, I think, how did he get permission? How did he find the exact right spot, the exact room to darken so that we could get a perfect shot of the Eiffel Tower? But in practical terms, this is what a camera obscura would have looked like, and as an artist, you would have started drawing over that. So that's how a lot of, have you noticed that art painting, say prior to, well, I'm going to show you some examples, but do you think that this was a valuable tool for artists? Or do you think they just drew that well, naturally, by eye? They probably did a combination, right? But certainly, artists that we would consider the old masters, quote unquote, use the camera obscura. And its most famous and controversial person is Johan Vermeer. Anyone recognize that name? Couple of people. Okay, so he was a Flemish or Dutch painter in the 1600s. So this picture that we have here is called The Music Lesson, and we look at it and we think, well, how in the world did he get something so realistic? This picture is actually his studio. So this is Vermeer's studio. And there is an entire website devoted to deconstructing Vermeer's work and showing exactly how it was laid out and exactly how he created all of these using, to the point where they have figured out where his camera obscura would be placed in the room. So people are that nuts, okay? They are that crazy about figuring out how artists create what they create. So this picture, The Music Lesson, think about it. So he's viewing this from a camera obscura room built into his studio, and he's actually, so all of the precision in the architecture, I'm not saying Vermeer couldn't draw, certainly he could draw, but this is how, at least probably 50% of the art world believed that he created some of that imagery. So using a camera obscura. Here's another one. Okay, see if you can recognize this. It's the same room. Check that out. So this is called The Geographer. And so can you just imagine him? He's all the way back in the studio, back to the wall, and viewing his model, who looks a little, actually his model looks a little uncomfortable because he probably had to stand that way for a very long time. But we're looking at actually the same room. Okay, so now does this make more sense? So for centuries, people are trying to figure out how to fix the image from a camera obscura. How in the world can I take this and make it permanent? So a number of scientists, artists, gentlemen with a lot of time and money on their hands, tried various methods to fix the image. And finally, here's the first surviving photograph. So again, using a camera obscura, so I am going to completely, actually I think his name is pronounced Nipsey, but I cannot be sure of that because I do not speak French, so I'm not going to even attempt that. So this is in 1826, 1827. And you can see, so this is his house. This is the view from a window in his house. Now this is not the earliest photograph, but it is the earliest surviving photograph. So previous to this, there are some things that we have, notes about or were written about, but we don't have evidence of. But this actually still exists. You can actually go and look at it. So one of the things that's notable about this image is, okay, well, you tell me, what's notable about this image? Shirley, contrast. So it's high contrast, black and white. Anybody else? It's grayscale, yeah, so we're not dealing with color at all. What else? Thomas?
I was about to say the vector, but I just remembered that that's lines and curves.
You're right. You're right. So vector is lines and curves, raster is pixels. Yeah, okay, so that's a different topic, but that's good knowledge. Good knowledge in the brain. Okay, so one thing that's notable to people who look at this and know anything about lighting is that there's lighting on both sides of his courtyard. So you can just barely see it. So the exposure time was 8 hours or more. He exposed that thing all day, and the sun moved during that time. And so the first surviving photograph is actually had an exposure time of somewhere between 8 and 10 hours. And he managed to fix the image. So this guy obviously had some time on his hands. He had the money, and he had the desire to experiment. And so he's credited with the first surviving photograph. Okay, so this is a super short lesson in photographic history here. But so there were a whole number of processes, but one of them took off, and that was the daguerreotype. So Designs on Silver Bright comes from a 4-line poem written about Daguerre's work. So Daguerre, I'm not going to have you look him up now. I'm going to tell you how his process worked. So this is a young Abraham Lincoln. And so what Daguerre would do is he would take a shiny, super shiny copper plate, and he would coat it with a light-sensitive compound that's silver-based. And then he fixed it using a salt solution of some kind. Okay, so so here's his camera. Now by this time we have lenses. So that's a primitive lens. But this is still just a camera obscura with a lens on it, right? It's a box camera. You can has anyone ever made a pinhole camera? Dalen has. So tell me about that.
Right, so we did a thing like this oatmeal box, and we'll completely spray everything black, electrical tape photos of the white going through. And then on the very, very back, we had a piece of film that we taped it down there. Make sure the hole's covered. We had a piece of cardboard that was covering the hole so the light would come in. And then we pointed at an object we wanted to leave it open for about 30 seconds or so and let it the one that we wanted to post it.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work.
Okay, so pinhole cameras are actually a common, they're kind of a common grade school to high school project or even a science project. So some people have done them, and there's an entire school of pinhole photography. You can go out on the internet and you'll find like whole sections of deviantart.com devoted to pinhole photography. And this is one step above pinhole photography, but it's a big step because we have a lens which we can focus and create a highly sharp, beautiful image. Now, what are the limitations of this? Okay, actually, let me ask you another question. Does anybody have a family daguerreotype lying around? Like, do your grandparents have one, or maybe great-great-grandparents or something like that? Sometimes I get somebody who has one. Okay, so these were so precious that people will save them for generations. And so we have this photograph of Abe Lincoln when he was just a senator in 1846, and it's still in perfect condition. So pros of the daguerreotype. We'll talk pros and cons. Pros: perfect, sharp, crisp, and over 150 years later, it still looks pretty good, doesn't it? Perfect, sharp, crisp, and it stands the test of time. So it has longevity. That's probably the better way to do it, to talk about it. So it became extremely popular. Its other pro was that it was inexpensive. So you did not have to be super rich to get a daguerreotype made of your family, for example. So people so the common person could go to a photography studio, the photography became a profession, and you could go get your portrait taken. And that was a huge advance. Prior to that, the only people, remember, whose images were considered worthy enough to preserve were rich, titled, or both. So culturally, that's a huge shift, right? And so from 1820 to 1846, we got a huge advance in photography. Okay, limitations. Here's the limitation that brought the daguerreotype down. You could only have one. So now if we could get Abraham Lincoln to sit still for like 7 hours, maybe they could have multiple daguerreotypes made of him in that position, right? But he'd have to sit for every single one. So they were a one-off. That was their main limitation. You only got one. So they were not reproducible at all. So that became their limitation. So a little bit later on in time, so now here we are, all this stuff is kind of occurring together. So developments in photography are occurring together. And the next process that started to become popular was called the calotype. So calo means beautiful, and type means impression. And so the calotype was invented by William Henry Fox Talbot, and it actually was the first negative process. So he produced, this is a piece of paper. So he would use a camera obscura with a lens, and he would get a negative, paper negative, of the subject, and that could be printed multiple times. So prose, even less expensive, and it could be printed multiple times. So you could go to a photo studio, and you could, people who were enamored of the calotype process and negatives you could have multiples of whatever you were photographing. Whereas with the daguerreotype, you could only have one. But there's a trade-off. Who knows who this is? Who's Frederick Douglass? Michael. Frederick Douglass? Oh, I thought you raised your hand. All right. Who knows who Frederick Douglass is? Yes, sir. Ty.
He was activist who worked alongside with Lacey. He also worked alongside
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did.
He was also a philosopher and a speaker.
Mm-hmm. And he was the first African American nominee for Vice President of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is him as a very young man. So there exist daguerreotypes of Frederick Douglass all the way from, this is the earliest one, I think, but he had a very long career. He escaped from slavery in Maryland, and he was an active abolitionist. And he was a very active writer too. He wrote a best-selling book about his life, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And later on, he wrote another autobiography that covered the Civil War and beyond. And thanks to the daguerreotype process, we still have beautiful images of him. And this one is just particularly nice. I wanted to look at that. And then this is a calotype. This is William Henry Fox Talbot's family. And so looking at this, you can see the difference of the two processes. So here we have high contrast, sharp image, beautiful lighting, and here we have, it's a lot softer, isn't it? It even has water spots, which are probably the result of just time and aging. It fades, so the calotype didn't really take off because it was not as permanent as the daguerreotype. However, it's significant because it's the first process that's a negative. So then later on we get negative film, and then the world is revolutionized again. But these two examples give you an idea of the differences between the two in terms of aesthetics. So we have our trade-off of permanence versus reproducibility, right? Okay, so we actually already covered this. So photography became a replacement for some kinds of painting. So this is, does anybody know who this is? It's Napoleon. Yeah, it's Napoleon on his horse, looking like a big hero, right, of the French Revolution. And so this is by Jacques-Louis David, who was a painter of the French Academy. He was one of the most famous painters of the French Academy. So of course, I don't think the horse was in a room with a camera obscura. I think multiple studies were probably done in order to capture Napoleon and on horseback in that position. But certainly, I would define this painting as a form of propaganda. Think about it. How is Napoleon being portrayed? Hero, savior, right? And since he paid for it, he got to decide how he was depicted. Whereas with photography, we are depicting what people looked like in real life, actual images of actual human beings. Okay, so later on, we move on to photography as an art form. Now, photography at first was not accepted as an art form in its own right. In fact, there were huge debates over whether photography could be considered an art form at all, because it required no special training. At that time, of course, there were no photography schools, and everyone's just inventing this as they go along. But later on, say in the late 1800s to the early 1920s, people started to experiment with photography, and photography started to become recognized as an art form in its own right. So these are two images. This one, this artist is Cindy Sherman, and believe it or not, she went through a phase in which she recreated famous paintings, and using herself as the model, photographed herself as all of these different famous paintings. So if you ever get a chance to look at Cindy Sherman's work, it's really worth a look. She became famous at a pretty early age with a series called Untitled Film Stills, in which she was replicating famous films, and then later she was replicating the idea of being represented on film as a woman. Okay, and here we have Jerry Yulesman, who, how do you think he did this? We know it wasn't Photoshop, right? Because Photoshop was invented in 1990. So actually, this was done in the darkroom with masking. So each one of these pieces is a separate photograph that was exposed one by one in layers onto an enlarger. And the stuff that I'm going to teach you in Photoshop follows the model of traditional photography. So when I talk about masking, that's what Jerry Yulesman did to create this photograph. Okay, so there's a lot of other examples of photography as an art form out there, but I liked these two for today. Okay, so then we have photography becomes a cultural, historical, documentary process. You know, the Civil War was the first war to be widely photographed. So there are literally millions of photographs of the Civil War. And some of them are so at this point, we have photographers who are able to carry their equipment around. And a camera, so the classic photographer puts his head under a big dark cloth and photographs something. So photographers would follow Civil War battles around, and they would sometimes they capture action. There's actually a photograph of Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, and all you can see is his hat, his big, huge top hat. But yeah, so we have shorter exposure times, but still things are long enough that dead people were easier to photograph. So we have so you had to be sitting still, or you had to be a casualty of war to get an image on paper. So one of the most famous Civil War photographers his name is Matthew Brady, and this is his photograph. So if you choose, for example, the Civil War as, I probably would, just because I'm a Civil War buff, but what you would have to do is insert yourself into one of these photographs. So a lot of the Civil War, do you think they just fought battles all the time? No, what did they do? They traveled, they hung out, they got and photographers followed them, and so we have literally hundreds and hundreds of images of camps in the Civil War. So of soldiers just hanging out. And I can remember one particularly macabre series where one photographer took a photograph of a soldier dead against a tree, then came back later, a year later, and there's just his skeleton. Woo, scary. Okay, so then we have photography as documentary, so the technology is getting better and better all the time. Okay, this is not the only website that you can go to, but I'm going to recommend that if you have a phone out or you have your computer out right now, go to 100photos.time.com and just take a look at it. We're going to go there right now. And let's see what we have here. Okay, so this website is a great source for your next project because it's literally the most influential images of all time. So let's see. Okay, remember this one? Lunch atop a skyscraper? One of my students, Cord, inserted himself right there. Remember that one? Yeah. So you can take a look through this website and you'll see a lot of source material for you to choose from. Okay, you can also just search for photos by era or by person. Like I had a lot of sports photos. I had lots of basketball, I had lots of football, and as long as you can find a high enough resolution image, then you are good to go. So, okay, favorite football team, someone in the room? Greenville, of course, right? But second favorite football team?
Bears, shoot. Bears, shoot. Bears.
The Bears. Okay, I'm from Chicago, so Dre and I are going with the Bears. All right, so let's look at Bears. I'm from Chicago. The Cowboys can go scratch. Sorry. Yeah, now, so let's see what we can find in terms of images. Okay, so let's talk about a photograph that you might choose. Okay, so look at this. Take a look at this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a Google search on size. So I'm going to go larger than 2 megapixels, okay? Larger than 2 megapixels. And I'm going to see what's out there. So this would be a perfect one. This one's 4,000 pixels by 2,900 pixels. Let's open that one in a new tab. Hey. Okay, so what we would do here is we'd do save image as. And I'm actually going to, let's see, save image as. It doesn't want me to save. Yeah, hang on. Normally I can do save image as. I'm going to just open this image in a new tab, and I want to see if I can. Yep, here we go. So Control, save image as, and then it's giving me a non-standard format. The format you should be looking for is JPEG or PNG. So they've made it impossible for me to copy this photograph. However, I could still screenshot it, right? And I could work from that. So there are ways around that. But here's an example of a nice, clear, crisp sports photograph that you could insert yourself into, right? So you have to plan the shot. You'd have to find someone to photograph you. But let's say you want, so what I'm going to recommend is that you don't try to just replace your face. That instead, and this is why we're going to spend a lot of time on photography, actual learning about photography, is I want you to replace the whole body. So you're going to have to find someone to take your picture, have the lighting be right, and have it be sharp enough and of the right size. And we're going to go over all that in Photoshop, but that's why we're going to practice with our cameras. Okay, so you've got to match the lighting direction. If it's color, maybe we would use your arm, his head. We'd have to do something about the jersey. I'm not sure, but if you were a diehard Bears fan, maybe you have a Bears jersey that you could wear. So, but anyway, so that's what we're looking for. So we're looking for a high quality image, and it can be of anything you want. But I will say I got a lot of people use the 100 most influential images time, and I had a lot of people do various sports, and that's all totally fine, whatever you want to do. Just understand that I want your whole body in there and don't just replace your head. Okay? All right, cool so far? All right. So, back to our PowerPoint here. I'm playing it from the start. That's not what I want. Okay, so we have the historical photo assignment is up on D2L, and you can take a look at it. The assignment sheet's in there. But the real question is, what image do you want to use, and how are you going to shoot this particular image? So how are you going to get an image that matches? So how many people have a camera other than their phone? Okay, good. If you have one, of course you can use that, but we're not checking out cameras for this assignment. So my job is to help you get the best quality out of what you have. So whether that is, and so we've gotten some really cool stuff out of a mobile phone. So we're going to practice mobile phone photography, just like we're going to do mobile phone video. So choose the photo first, and then decide how you are going to photograph yourself and replace yourself in that picture. So we're going to go over today what we want in terms of the camera. So if this were a traditional photo class and we had digital SLRs, we could control a lot of different stuff. We could control exposure. Okay, exposure is how much light is reaching the image. Angle of view, are we, if you look at that football image that we just had on the screen, it's a straight on view. Or do you need a view from slightly above or a view from slightly below? So choosing your angle of view. Shutter speed, so a faster shutter speed would give you will capture action faster. And some people's phones, check out your phone because you might be able to change some of this in your phone. I can't because my phone is no good as a camera. But if you have a more advanced Android phone or an iPhone 7 or later, there's a lot that you can control. Okay, aperture, or how big the lens opening is. So the lens open, if we have a larger aperture, we let in more light. Smaller aperture lets in less light. So let's say we're out doing astrophotography. There's like a whole subculture of Greenville students who go out and do astrophotography at night at the field station. Have you guys ever been to the field station? Okay, the field station is like out in the middle of nowhere, and it's an observatory. So it's completely dark out there. You go out there around 2 in the morning, and you can get some pretty awesome photographs of the stars. So that would be an example of we need to let more light in, right? Depth of field, or what's in focus and what's not. Is everything in focus, or do we have some things that are blurred out in the background and some things that are sharp in the foreground, or the reverse? Lens perspective, I'm going to talk about in a minute. So different lenses will give you different results. Your phone has a wide angle lens. And so it's going to give you certain distortions that I'm going to show you how to correct for. And film speeds or ISO, lighting. With your mobile phone, what do we have to work with? Pretty much this. Your angle of view, depth of field, lens perspective, we know we have a wide angle lens, and your lighting. So your best tool for your mobile phone is good lighting, pick the right angle of view, and understand that you're dealing with a wide angle lens, and that's going to give you certain limiting factors. Okay, so let's talk about when you take a selfie, you just go, right? But do you pay attention to the edges of the frame? Yeah. So you want to make sure you get everything and everyone in the picture that you need. So in the same way, you are going to be you're going to be photographing each other, and that's just the way it goes, because this has to be a photograph of you. So that's why everyone in this room needs to become a good mobile phone photographer. Okay, so we look at the edges of the frame. We make sure for this type of photography, yeah, go ahead. For this type of photography, what we really need is usually we need the whole body in the frame. So if we're doing a sports photograph, we need your whole body. If you're doing something that's more of a portrait, you have to match what type of composition it is to the composition of that original photograph. And also we use, we're going to practice this, the rule of thirds. Okay, some people, if you look through your camera settings, you'll actually find that it'll give you the rule of thirds. Most Apple phones will do that. And so if you look at any photograph that is, not any photograph, but most photographs that are compositionally or not necessarily historically, but artistically significant, and a lot of painting and a lot of design uses the rule of thirds. And that simply states, the rule of thirds simply states that you divide your picture space mentally into 9 little blocks, and a corner is where your main subject should be. So here, who's heard of Ansel Adams? So he's one of the most famous landscape photographers of all time. But how do you see the rule of, how's he using the rule of thirds in this photograph? Where's the focal point? Marissa? Marissa says, never mind. Where's the focal point?
Is it the bend in the river?
Yes, Jacob, very good. The bend, you could say the bend of the river, and this is his vanishing point. I actually think that's his focal point. But yeah, he's leading your eye through this. Okay, so here's another thing that we can control to some extent with a mobile phone. We can control depth of field to a limited extent with a mobile phone. The closer you get to the subject, so if I take I don't have my phone with me, but if I did, let's pretend this is my phone. The closer I get to the subject, the more out of focus everything in the background becomes. The further I am away from the subject, the more depth of field. So if I'm close up on whatever I'm photographing, I'm going to get it's called a shallow depth of field. So depth of field is the zone of acceptable sharpness. Yes, Tyler? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So the reason do you want to expand on that? Because I'm not covering it because we're dealing with a mobile phone, but do you want to expand on that a little bit? Yeah. Next time. Okay, so Tyler will teach us about aperture and depth of field next time. Okay. All right. So, but with a mobile phone, since we can't do, yeah, he just gave himself more work. So since we have a mobile phone and we can't change our aperture, we can change how close we are to the subject We can change our angle of view. So the further away from the subject, the more is in focus. The closer we are to the subject, the less is in focus. And I talked about lens perspective, and I said I would get to that. Okay, so I said your phone has a wide-angle lens. So guess what a wide-angle lens does? It distorts. So if you're trying to flatter the human face, for example, have you ever noticed that like your nose looks a little off in a selfie and you think, is my nose really that big? Yeah, so, or you're, I sometimes do. A wide-angle lens distorts the subject's face. So it's not widely used, so you're never supposed to use a wide-angle lens for portraits. Now, we can't help it. We're stuck with the equipment that we have. So we need to make sure that we're not distorting the people that we're photographing and giving them weird-looking features. And we also need to make sure that we have a zone of acceptable sharpness. So depth of field, zone of acceptable sharpness. Okay, and Tyler will teach us about this later on. No, I'm teasing you. I'm actually not going to make you teach about it at all. But anyone who takes a traditional photography course is going to learn an awful lot about aperture, or f-stop, and we are not. So here's another thing about your mobile phone. So we said if you use it up close, it's going to distort your picture. But it also has, because it is a wide-angle lens by its nature has very great depth of field. So you can get most things in focus at the right distance. Okay, so this would be an expanded perspective. You get more in focus using the wide-angle lens on your mobile phone than you do using a traditional camera. And that's just kind of built into the system. Okay, so if we had a camera, we would be able to switch up lenses. And we don't have a camera, so we're going to skip that part. Okay, now let's talk about something else you can control, lighting. So on Thursday, we are going to play with lighting. So I'm going to teach you how to get good lighting using just mobile phones. And we're going to look at what types of lighting we can reasonably expect, soft lighting versus hard lighting. I'm going to teach you a basic three-point lighting setup for a portrait, and we're going to practice that in here. But we also want to look at, when you choose your photograph, choose it carefully and look at the lighting. So for example, why am I saying this is an example of backlighting? Where's the sun? Yeah, it's over here on the left. And although it's out of the picture, we almost have a silhouette because everything is lit from behind. So that's backlighting. So pay attention to that when you choose your picture. Okay, so here what we're going to be practicing in the beginning is just getting good shots with available light. So if you were trying to place yourself in this picture, you would want to make sure that you match the lighting direction and quality. Kathy, did you have a question? Okay. Okay, so here's an example of side lighting, which we're going to do for our, if you look at most photographs, you will see that they have a specific lighting direction. So they're either going to be lit from the front, from the side, from the back, or some combination of all three. And we can also look at the quality of light, so soft versus hard lighting. So you can see this image of, I don't know why I'm stuck on Marilyn Monroe here, but this image of Marilyn is considered hard lighting. So this was taken with a flash. And so we have sharp, hard shadows. We have a very distinct direction to the light. And this image, which is of a movie star, and now I'm blanking on her name, is soft lighting. So this one's Marilyn. This one is someone else. So you want to match the lighting to the historical photo that you choose. Okay, left here. That's the end of our technical lecture for